Hockey is truly a one-of-a-kind sport, one that demands unparalleled physicality, stamina, and skill. Its popularity has soared over time, going from a relatively niche sport in the early 20th century into one of the big four North American sports. The game has grown internationally over the decades. Perhaps most controversially, it has expanded to warm weather climates in the American South. Many longtime fans have a negative perception of these Sunbelt teams, especially if their team was relocated to one of these expansion efforts by the NHL. The perception has changed over time though, with the NHL granting Las Vegas an expansion team to begin in 2017. The Golden Knights made it to the Stanley Cup Finals in their first year of existence, and have remained a powerhouse ever since. In 2023, the Vegas Golden Knights hoisted the Stanley Cup in front of a raucous crowd to finally prove that hockey could not only survive, but thrive in the desert environment. In contrast to the immediate and rousing success of the Knights, 200 miles southeast sit the Arizona Coyotes, the NHL's first attempt to grow the game in the desert. They are the hockey version of Charlie Brown trying to kick the football. Every time there's a glimmer of hope, Lucy lifts the football right from under them, and they fall over. Yet they continue to get up every time, no matter how futile it may seem, and keep trying to kick the ball, even when everyone is screaming at them not to. The Coyotes are truly unlike any team in professional sports. Many teams suffer financial losses, many teams suffer long stretches of losing, but the Coyotes are unique with how consistently they existed in this state of torment. For every tiny victory this team has gotten, they have suffered several crushing defeats to drown the fleeting feeling of happiness that most teams get to experience on a yearly basis. This sort of rot wasn't born in the Sonoran Desert, however. The story of this franchise's pain began in the bitter Manitoba cold. By the late 60s and early 70s, the NHL had recently expanded to assert itself as the premier hockey league in North America, but they were still holding on to unfair labor practices for their players. Players were at the mercy of their organizations and held very little bargaining power with their contracts, which were outrageously low to begin with. In 1971, a new league was founded to directly challenge the NHL, the World Hockey Association. The WHA was successfully able to lure several NHL players with the promise of better pay, with none more famous than Bobby Hull. Hull signed a previously unheard of 10-year, $2.5 million contract with one of the league's founding teams, the Winnipeg Jets. The Jets were one of the few bright spots in a league that was otherwise mired by financial trouble. Thanks to their roster full of genuine NHL talent, the Jets earned a trip to the finals in 5 of the league's 7 years of operation. They won the Avco World Trophy 3 times in that span, with the final of which coming against the Edmonton Oilers and their 18-year-old phenom, Wayne Gretzky. After the 1979 WHA Finals, the league finally ran out of steam and agreed to merge with the NHL. This merger would bring 4 of the remaining 6 teams to the NHL: the Edmonton Oilers, Hartford Whalers, Atlanta Flames, and our Winnipeg Jets. The journey to the next level proved difficult thanks to the NHL's insistence on treating the WHA teams as expansion franchises. The 4 teams had to pay a $6 million expansion fee to the league right from the get-go, and were subject to a reclamation draft. This was essentially a culling of their rosters of NHL talent, with former players being forcibly returned to their old teams. After the reclamation draft, the newly founded teams had to rebuild their rosters through an extremely limited expansion draft. Apart from a few exceptions, such as the Jets getting to keep Bobby Hull and the Oilers keeping Wayne Gretzky, these organizations had to start from the ground up. Because they had just been a contender in the WHA, the Jets found themselves even more devastated by this expansion than their fellow teams. The Jets finished at the bottom of the standings in their first NHL season, during which they traded their former star Bobby Hull to the Hartford Whalers. Their league worst 51 points would be followed up the next season with a pitiful 32 points. The Jets only had 9 wins on the season, and with the worst offense and defense in the league, easily earned the number 1 pick in the 1981 draft. Winnipeg used their number 1 pick on Dale Hawerchuk. The 18-year-old elevated the Jets immediately, winning the Calder in an incredible 103-point season. The Jets made the playoffs for the first time since joining the NHL, but were promptly defeated by the St. Louis Blues. This began a cycle that lasted from 1982 to 1988, where the Jets would make the playoffs thanks to stellar seasons from Hawerchuk, but could not break through the second round. Specifically, they could not get past Wayne Gretzky and his Oilers, who used Winnipeg as a pit stop en route to a Stanley Cup victory 4 times in this span. In 1990, the Jets found themselves facing the Oilers once again in the first round of the playoffs. This time was different, however, as Gretzky had been traded away the season prior. Winnipeg had upstart talent on their side, with goaltender Bob Essensa being voted to All-Rookie First Team. The Jets jumped on their opportunity by grabbing a 3-1 lead into the series, winning Game 4 in double overtime. They kept their foot on the gas going into Game 5, holding a 3-1 lead halfway through the second period. Unfortunately, the Oilers answered back a few minutes later and rode that momentum to a game-tying goal 13 seconds later. The Oilers would go on to win the game and stave off elimination. Game 6 in Winnipeg featured a nightmarish opening for the home team, with the Oilers jumping out to a 3-0 lead in the first period. While the Jets eventually overcame the deficit in the third period, it was undone just moments later with a decisive Oilers goal. The series was now tied at 3 going back to Edmonton. The wheels had fallen off the bus for the Jets, and their 1990 team was buried in the decisive Game 7 in Edmonton. After a decade of failing to break into the top tier of NHL, this series was the straw that broke the camel's back and forced change in Winnipeg. Longtime face of the franchise Dale Hawerchuk was sent alongside the Jets' first-round pick to the Buffalo Sabres for their pick and several players, including standout defenseman Phil Housley. In the 1990 draft, the Sabres selected Brad May, and the Jets selected Keith Tkachuk. Unfortunately, Tkachuk was not quite ready for the NHL yet, as the Jets regressed to a 63-point season in 90-91 without Hawerchuk. Their fortunes were quickly reversed in the 1991-92 season, where a resurgent Phil Housley combined with great seasons from Eddie Olczyk and Teppo Numminen to lead the Jets back to the playoffs. Despite veteran goaltender Bob Essensa having an outstanding season where he finished 4th in Vezina voting, he would not be starting their series against the Vancouver Canucks. The Game 1 starter would be 23-year-old Rick Tabaraki. The plan was working. The Jets stunned the Canucks crowd by taking Game 1 in Vancouver. Game 2 was a loss for the Jets, but Tabaraki saved 38 shots to keep an otherwise lopsided game close. The Jets came back to Winnipeg and outlasted the Canucks in both games, going up 3-1 in the series. A very physical first period in Game 5 remained scoreless for the first 17 minutes, but 2 quick Vancouver goals ultimately took the air out of Winnipeg's tires. The Canucks came out of the locker room with a foot on the gas, scoring 3 more goals to chase Tabaraki from the net. The Jets ultimately lost 8-2 and inexplicably announced that Tabaraki would be starting Game 6 in Winnipeg. As one would expect, Game 6 was an 8-3 drubbing by the Canucks, where there were no goaltender changes at all for the Jets. The 23-year-old rookie was being hung out to dry when the coach should have been handing it over to his Vezina finalist who was just sitting on the bench. John Paddock had a different vision, however. What if we just started Tabaraki again in Game 7? Well, as it turns out, that was not a winning strategy, as the Jets hit a brick wall and lost 5-0 in the decisive Game 7. Unlike their last playoff collapse, this was a young team that had arguably overperformed to get this series to 7 games. They would receive an infusion unlike any other in NHL history, however, with 1988 first-round pick Teemu Selanne finally making the move to the NHL from Finland. Selanne's rookie season was far and away the greatest rookie season in the sport's history, scoring a mind-boggling 132 points at age 22. With Phil Housley's playmaking at the blue line, this pair was practically guaranteed to score when given the opportunity. Selanne had easily shattered the rookie record for goals, which was held by Mike Bossy with 53. Selanne finished the 92-93 season with 76 goals, 23 more than the previous record. Even with weaker goaltending on the whole, the sheer firepower from these two players led the team to a better record than the season prior. They faced off against the Canucks once again, who improved in their own regards. Unfortunately, even with Bob Essensa now starting the series, the Jets were easily defeated in 6 games. It was time for change once again for the team, as Phil Housley was traded to St. Louis for more scoring depth. Phil Housley was the key to the team's success in the post-Hawerchuk era, and his absence was felt immediately. None felt the impact more than Teemu Selanne, who ended the 1993-94 season with 54 points, 78 fewer than the season prior with Housley. For some inexplicable reason, On March 15th, 1994, while the team's record was 19-44-8, the Jets traded their first round pick to the Edmonton Oilers for financial considerations. This ended up being the fourth overall pick in the draft that year. The Jets rebounded slightly in the lockout-shortened 1994-95 season, but still finished with a poor enough record to earn the seventh pick in the 1995 draft. Thankfully, they kept this pick, and they used it on a winger from the WHL, Shane Doan. He took the ice in Winnipeg at age 19 and showed promise right from the get-go in a very physical, Tkachuk-led squad. Teemu Selanne had returned to his old self, scoring 72 points in 51 games just in time to be traded to the Mighty Ducks of Anaheim in February 1996. Even without Selanne, the Jets snuck into the final playoff spot in the West, where they got to face the 131-point Detroit Red Wings. The Jets gave them a good fight, but they were eliminated in Game 6 on April 28, 1996. Behind the scenes, it was no secret that the Jets were struggling financially. The Canadian dollar's value had been plummeting throughout the 90s, which had a catastrophic effect on the Jets' ability to pay their players. Trading Phil Housley was perhaps the most egregious example, but the financial woes of this team explain several of the otherwise baffling moves in the 90s. The Jets certainly weren't alone. Every Canadian market was feeling the increased pressure that they were not used to feeling. Commissioner Gary Bettman remains a very controversial figure, with perhaps his most mired quality being his sheer dedication to growing the game in non-traditional markets, no matter the cost. The early 90s saw the NHL making moves in every direction to reshape its structure, reorienting itself away from Canada and towards the American Sunbelt. The beginning of Bettman's tenure in 1993 was in the middle of a 5-team expansion effort set forth by John Ziegler. The league had welcomed 3 teams in the past 2 seasons: the San Jose Sharks, Ottawa Senators, and Tampa Bay Lightning. The Florida Panthers and Mighty Ducks of Anaheim would follow suit 8 months into Bettman's tenure. The landscape of the NHL was rapidly changing, and Bettman accelerated this change by encouraging struggling franchises to move south. In 1993, a Minnesota North Stars team that had made the Stanley Cup Finals just 2 seasons prior was suddenly relocated to Dallas, Texas. Despite the abrupt move of the North Stars being unpopular with fans, especially those in Minnesota who are arguably more dedicated than anybody to hockey, the NHL took notice of the potential of Southern hockey and decided that this was the future for their struggling teams. After the 1994-95 lockout, the Quebec Nordiques, who played in the smallest and most remote market in the league, were moved to Denver to become the Colorado Avalanche. Colorado had previously attempted to have an NHL franchise, which was a short-lived disaster known as the Colorado Rockies. This growing market had serious potential to be tapped, and what better way to kickstart it than with a Stanley Cup win in their first season? The Avs had not even existed for a year, and already cemented their legacy and legacy of hockey in the West. Meanwhile, in the spring of 1996, we find our Winnipeg Jets bleeding money in the smallest market in the league. The Jets' ownership saw the writing on the wall and scrambled to find a buyer. They found a prospective group that was looking to bring hockey back to Minnesota after the untimely moving of the North Stars. Unfortunately, that deal would not get off the ground, however, due to a lack of an appropriate arena in Minnesota of all places. The next option, and the one they ultimately went with, was to pack their bags and find refuge in the Sonoran Desert.
Beep, beep.
Phoenix, Arizona, and its surrounding communities have been subject to exponential growth since the end of World War II. The population of the city had exploded from 65,000 in 1940 to nearly 440,000 just 20 years later. Even though the valley was isolated from other large population centers, the sheer population growth quickly led to an NBA expansion team in 1969, the Phoenix Suns. The Suns were the singular pride and joy of the city for nearly 2 decades, even as they failed to win a championship. But as the area's population kept increasing, Phoenix was often cited as a market for struggling sports teams to potentially move to. In 1988, the city got their second professional sports team, the Phoenix Cardinals. The Cardinals may have been terrible for their first decade in the desert, but they nonetheless proved that the Phoenix market could support multiple pro teams. After all, the Valley has always been welcoming to sports of all kinds. While they never had a professional team beforehand, Phoenix was no stranger to hockey as a whole. In 1967, the Phoenix Roadrunners began play in the Veterans Memorial Coliseum for the Western Hockey League, one of several minor leagues that was looking to merge with the NHL in the future. The Roadrunners were consistently popular in town for a minor league team, and their rowdy crowds during repeat championships in 1973 and 74 were foundational to the stadium's nickname, the Madhouse on McDowell. Unfortunately, the WHL ceased operations following the Roadrunners' second championship in 1974, and the team was absorbed into the WHA, where they would face off against the Winnipeg Jets very often. The Roadrunners' short time in the WHA was very similar to how most franchises in the league were handled. Sandy Hockwell was a former beloved player that won the WHL's award for Best Defenseman twice, and later coached the team to the repeat championships. After just 2 seasons in the new WHA, and after winning Coach of the Year, the Roadrunners inexplicably fired Hockwell and replaced him with Al Rollins. Rollins was not well liked by the Roadrunner faithful, who remembered his time coaching the rival Salt Lake Golden Eagles. The financial instability of the WHA also made it so that the Roadrunners quite literally needed to sell players to pay the rent for the building, which resulted in a disastrous 1977 campaign where the team dropped by over 20 points in the standings. Along with several other WHA teams, the Roadrunners folded in the 1977 offseason. Over a decade would pass without hockey in the Valley, until 1989 when the IHL brought a new iteration of the Roadrunners to town. Unlike the last iteration, this team used a gray and blue color scheme. This version of the Roadrunners was ironically the most stable the team had been, playing in the Madhouse for 8 seasons throughout the 90s. However, by the time 1996 rolled around, it was finally time for professional hockey to make its debut in the desert. The Phoenix Coyotes, fresh with their bold Kachina-inspired logo, began play in 1996 in America West Arena. This arena was originally built as the new home for the Phoenix Suns just a few years prior, and was not intended to host hockey in the long term. The larger rink size compared to an NBA court led to many obstructed sightlines throughout the arena, which hampered the team's ability to draw a sellout crowd from the get-go. Even with its faults, it was absolutely an upgrade from the 40-year-old Winnipeg Arena. The relocation brought much of the same roster from Winnipeg, captained by a 24-year-old Keith Tkachuk. The roster had shown that they were good enough for the playoffs already, and they bolstered it before taking the ice. In August 1996, the Coyotes traded for the Blackhawks' Jeremy Roenick, one of the most popular players in the league for his outspoken nature and physical play style. Their backstop was Nikolai Khabibulin, who was still only 24 but showed promise as the team's goaltender of the future. The first game in Coyotes history was also their only game played in Hartford, Connecticut, where they lost 1-0 to the Whalers. Thankfully, the team rebounded and won their first game under the Coyotes' name 5-2 against the Boston Bruins just 2 days later. They won their home opener as well against the San Jose Sharks, with the crowd hearing Werewolves of London after every goal. As a whole, the team started slow, but they improved as the season went on, and they were rising in the standings. They ended their inaugural season with 83 points, which was good enough for the 5th seed in the West. The Coyotes had the chance to take the Valley by storm, but had to go through the Mighty Ducks and old friend Teemu Selanne. This was the first best-of-7 playoff series for both markets, and the Ducks rode that momentum to win the first 2 games on home ice. The Coyotes kept the whiteout tradition from their days in Winnipeg, and even if it didn't make much thematic sense, the local crowd absolutely loved it from day one. The Coyotes tied the series up at 2 games apiece, clamping down with their physical play. In the pivotal Game 5 in Anaheim, the Coyotes kept their foot on the gas, and routed the Ducks 5-2. The Coyotes had a 3-2 advantage in the series, and just needed to win Game 6 on their home ice to advance to the next round. Paul Kariya opened the scoring for Anaheim in the second, as the Ducks would add another goal in the second to go up 2-0 going into the third. The Coyotes got one back halfway through the third, and with little over 2 minutes left, Keith Tkachuk tied it up on the power play. Game 6 ended up going to overtime, with the Coyotes just needing 1 goal to advance to the semifinals. 7 minutes into overtime, Teemu Selanne dumps the puck into the offensive zone. Paul Correa took this as an exceptionally long pass and absolutely rips it past Bobby Bullen. The Ducks pulled off the overtime win and they'd head back home for Game 7. Unfortunately, Anaheim used their momentum to shut out the Coyotes in the decisive Game 7. It was a heartbreaking fumbling of an opportunity to make a strong first impression in the Valley, but this was still a strong first season for a team in a new market after all. Before the season, Jim Schoenfeld was brought in to replace the inexperienced Don Hay. Schoenfeld had just finished a 4-season tenure with the Washington Capitals, where they made the playoffs in 3 of them. General manager Bobby Smith hoped to get the most out of his star players, and they started off the season relatively strong. They held a playoff spot for most of the beginning of the season, but started to taper off as time went on. After a cold streak in February surrounding the 2-week break for the 1998 Winter Olympics, it seemed like the Coyotes were going to miss the playoffs. Miraculously, however, the team buckled down and won 7 of their final 10 games, 5 of which were 1-goal victories. They finished with 82 points, and were up to face the defending champion Detroit Red Wings in the first round. After a predictable 6-3 loss to open the series, the Coyotes shocked Detroit by scoring 7 at Joe Louis Arena. The Red Wings opened Game 3 with 2 goals in the first minute, but Rick Tocchet and Jeremy Roenick stormed back in the third period to give the Coyotes the win. The wheels fell off the bus, however, as the Red Wings rattled off 3 consecutive wins to take the series 4-2. There's absolutely no shame in losing this series, though, especially because it proved to be the toughest challenge the Red Wings would face en route to another Stanley Cup Finals victory. This was the team's 3rd season in the Valley, and the mostly static roster was still looking for their first playoff series victory. They were always close, but could never break through to the next level. After dropping the first game of the season, the Coyotes went on an unprecedented tear, winning 14 of their next 17 games and tying the remaining 2. Bobby Bullen not only rebounded from a poor season the year prior, but became one of the best goaltenders in the entire league. The Coyotes spent the beginning of the season atop the Western Conference, but they lost 11 of 13 games in the middle of February and fell into the familiar mediocre mix they've been accustomed to. They managed to right the ship late in the season and finished strong enough to earn the 4th seed in the West and were set to face the St. Louis Blues. After dropping Game 1 at home, the Coyotes rattled off 3 straight 1-goal victories, grabbing a 3-1 series lead with 2 road wins. In Game 5, Phoenix held a 1-0 lead until the middle of the 3rd period and ultimately lost the game in overtime. The Yotes again held a 1-goal lead in the 2nd period of Game 6, only to let in 3 unanswered to bring the series back to Phoenix again. It was time for Game 7 once again, with a chance to finally get to the 2nd round for the first time in Arizona. Both sides played a physical and grueling game, one that remained scoreless for all of regulation. The teams continued their battle for 17 minutes of overtime, at which point Ricard Persson fired on the net. The deflection from Pierre Turgeon gave the Blues a 1-0 win in the decisive Game 7. The blown 3-1 series lead was officially cemented in the record books. There was no denying it anymore. The Coyotes had officially carried over the Jets' playoff curse. The team parted ways with head coach Jim Schoenfeld after the season, but retained most of their key roster pieces. Even while much of the Coyotes' core continued to stay the same, they were presented with new challenges. Star goaltender Nikolai Khabibulin was in a contract dispute with management and wouldn't play for the entire season as a result. The Coyotes had to rely on a tandem of mid-30s goalies to start the season, all-reliable Babasensa and Mikhail Stalinkov. The team seemed to rally in this adversity, however, as they won 8 of their first 11 games to start the season. Much of the team's success in the face of adversity can be credited to head coach Bobby Francis. Although he was a first-time NHL head coach, he was brought in to provide an offensive philosophy the team sorely needed. As the season went on, however, the results cooled off. The team managed to finish with 90 points, the same total as the year prior despite the coaching change. As the 6th seed, they got to face the Colorado Avalanche in the first round. The Coyotes were outplayed at every turn by the Joe Sakic-led powerhouse, being at the wrong end of a gentleman's sweep right out of the playoffs. The Avalanche were on an entirely different level from the Coyotes, and this series would just prove how far away these franchises really were from each other. The Coyotes continued to sit in neutral, as this was now the fourth season where they failed to advance in the playoffs. With the team's core starting to reach their 30s, this was seen as the last shot before the Coyotes would need to truly rebuild. Sean Burke got comfortable as the team's starter, and Cobby Bullen was sent to Tampa Bay where he finally would get his big contract. The team started off even stronger than the season prior, leading the Pacific Division to begin the season. The success would slowly fade away as the holidays approached, however, and the Coyotes were stuck in the familiar mix of lower-seeded playoff teams. Once it became clear that the team plateaued early in the season yet again, it was finally time for change. On March 13, 2001, Keith Tkachuk was sent to St. Louis for a first-round pick and a few solid young players in Ladislav Nagy and Michael Handzus. Mercifully, the Canucks held the tiebreaker over the Coyotes for the final playoff spot, so we were spared from another massacre at the hands of the Avalanche. Now that they missed the playoffs for the first time since moving to Phoenix, it was finally the end of an era. With Tkachuk gone, Jeremy Roenick moved on to Philadelphia, where he would continue producing at a high level. The old guard was thinning out, but with Teppo Numminen being named captain, the future was still bright for the Coyotes. The team saw the sudden roster shift not as a rebuild, but rather a retool into a different core. The front office made a bold move, trading a second-round pick and a 2003 first-round pick for 25-year-old RFA Damon Langkow. The team exceeded expectations this season, with Langkow proving to be a valuable piece of the new core, with a career-high 62 points. The season also saw the emergence of Daniel Briere, who had been with the team since 1997. He finished 2002 with 60 points, which is 20 more than he had in his first 4 seasons combined. The returns in the Tkachuk trade were panning out, with Handzus and Nagy both having 40 points to finally aid depth scoring. Rookie Chris Kolanos had a strong rookie season, and on March 30th, 2002, he scored a penalty shot on Patrick Waugh. Waugh's explosive reaction became the focus of the team's 2002 whiteout commercial.
Hockey stick, $48. Skates, $275. Official NHL puck, $10. Making a future Hall of Fame goalie cry like a little baby.
Kolanos, he scored! Now Patrick throws his stick. Oh, he's upset.
Priceless.
The team had regained some of its former swagger as they finished the season with a then-team record of 95 points on the season. In a hyper-competitive Western Conference, this was good enough for the 6th seed and a matchup with the heavyweight San Jose Sharks. In Game 1, a second-period goal by Patrick Marleau, assisted by our old friend Teemu Selanne, would ultimately be the game winner for the Sharks. Game 2 was an entirely different story, with Langkow, Doan, and Briere powering the team to a 3-1 win on the road. Once the Coyotes returned home, however, their offense went quiet as the Sharks outscored them 10-3 in the final 3 games of the series. The only offense generated was by Shane Doan and by penalty shots. Only the Coyotes could have such a disappointing finish in a season where they objectively exceeded expectations. The Coyotes roster remained mostly the same for the 2002-03 season, but the flaws in the roster that were exposed by San Jose continued to weigh the team down. The team's all-star goaltender Sean Burke began the season with health issues and was sidelined by mid-October. The team had its struggles, but ultimately treaded water in the standings until Sean Burke's return in December. Upon his return, Burke was playing some of the best hockey of his career, posting a .936 save percentage and a 10-3-1 record between December and March. This resurgence actually gave the Coyotes an outside shot at a playoff spot, but on March 20th, Sean Burke exited a game against Edmonton with an injury. He would be sidelined for the next week, which is all the team needed to absolutely implode. They won just one of their final 8 games and finished the season with 78 points. This was the worst finish in the team's time in Phoenix, and they didn't even have a draft pick to show for it. The Coyotes' draft pick was property of the Flyers thanks to the Langkow trade, and they used the pick to select Jeff Carter 11th overall. The 2003 draft is often considered one of the best of all time, mostly due to the sheer depth of quality players. The Coyotes didn't have a pick in this draft until the third round. In the first round, they missed out on the likes of Zach Parise, Brett Burns, and Brent Seabrook. The second round could have given them Patrice Bergeron, Shea Weber, or David Backes, among others. But instead, they continued barreling into a future that they did not prepare for. Behind the scenes, trouble had been brewing for the team. America West Arena was known to be a terrible venue for hockey, with many seats having an obstructed view of the ice. Jerry Colangelo, the Suns owner at the time, was instrumental in getting the Coyotes to Phoenix and setting them up for potential future success, but the team clearly needed their own building. Phoenix businessman Richard Burke was the Coyotes' original owner, and he was adamant about making sure the team stayed put. Burke unfortunately could not weather the financial losses downtown and was looking for potential buyers that would keep the team in the valley. One of those buyers was Phoenix-based Ellman Companies and their owner, Steve Ellman. In 1995, 6 years prior to owning the Coyotes, Steve Ellman purchased the Los Arcos Mall in Scottsdale, Arizona. In an all-too-common cycle in Phoenix, the Vintage Mall was going through hard times as a result of new competition springing up nearby. Ellman Companies immediately began workshopping new ideas for the property, and with the Coyotes publicly needing a new arena in the late 90s, this site seemed like the perfect match. In 1997, Ellman unveiled 3 potential redevelopments of the property, one of which being a new stadium for the Coyotes. A year later in 1998, Ellman created a concrete proposal for the new development. The $600 million development would include the new stadium and a power center for big box stores. Because Steve Ellman wasn't actually wealthy enough to build an NHL arena on his own, the site would be funded by public tax dollars. This surprisingly ended up not being a problem in May 1999, where record public turnout in favor of the arena helped move the process towards another vote in November. Ellman did himself no favors by announcing a proposal to recapture all tax funds generated by the property over a 30-year period, which effectively would have put a huge subsidy on Scottsdale residents. Regardless, the people of Scottsdale wanted hockey in town, and they came out to vote for the measure. Things were actually looking good for the future of the team, but cracks began to show when owner Richard Burke could not agree with Steve Ellman on financing and the construction timeline, which would render the Coyotes stuck at America West Arena for another 4 seasons. In what may have been seen as the logical move at the time, the team was sold in full to Steve Ellman for $87 million in April 2000. With the same person owning both the team and the property to build the stadium on, as well as public support being on their side, it really seemed like this could actually work. Unfortunately, even with all of the help provided by the city and local residents, the reality is that Steve Ellman did not have the money to be a proper NHL owner, much less financing a brand new stadium in the most expensive part of the Phoenix area. Even with freshly retired legend Wayne Gretzky signing on as a minority owner, it took over a year for the sale of this team to be finalized. Once Ellman was actually given the keys to the franchise and told to put up or shut up, his grandiose plans would continuously be scaled back. It took just 5 months for him to begin to scout other potential sites in other cities, despite the wishes of Scottsdale voters. By 2001, Ellman had officially given up on his own plan to develop a stadium in the Los Arcos Mall and set his eyes on a completely new plan. On April 11, 2001, the rug was pulled out from under everyone's feet, and the team's plans would move westward. Instead of building a new arena in the core of the Phoenix area where the fan base was actually located and fulfilling his promises to the Scottsdale taxpayers, Ellman had a master plan for an entirely new entertainment district on the west side of town. His company bought up a bunch of cheap farmland in suburban Glendale, and work began on the new Westgate City Center. Even though the ownership had obviously cheapened out with the land itself, the Westgate development on its own was an ambitious undertaking. The project would be built out in multiple phases, starting with the arena to open in 2003 and eventually working out into retail and residential accommodations by the end of 2006. The major flaw with this plan wasn't with the arena itself, but with just how far away it was from the core fans in the valley. It was 15 miles west of America West Arena, which further alienated those living in Scottsdale or the greater Mesa area. With games often starting at 7 p.m. local time, the only way to get to the arena for most people was to trek across the I-10 during rush hour. Any person that's been to Phoenix can tell you how much that drive sucks and should be avoided unless it's absolutely necessary. But that was the reality for hockey in Arizona now. On top of the new arena, it was time for a uniform update. Out with the Kachina and in with the Sedona Red as we enter the Howling Head years.